Hi there, my dear friends, and welcome back to another episode of Whispering Wikipedia. Now, as always, I'd like to invite you to comment down below if you have any further topics which you'd like me to read about in this series. The main reason I do this series is personally because I love discovering new topics to talk about. This gives me a dependable kind of outlet to find and discover new things which I otherwise wouldn't have done. And I think personally the best way to find out about new topics is to get other people to tell you things that you wouldn't have otherwise researched. Now, we've been looking at feminism, of course, very interestingly for me, because I didn't know much about this before beginning the research. Today we're moving on to feminism and its science and its impact on science. Also, if you're interested, I am growing my beard back. It'll probably get to lengths which were similar to before. If you remember from my old ASMR channel, I had a bit of a wizard-like beard. Also, I'm sorry if my skin looks a bit strange or pale. I still have to balance the white on my Canon 70D camera. And looking in the viewfinder right now, I look like a sickly Victorian child. Maybe it'll look different after I colour correct. Anyway, without further ado, let's have a little bit of a research. Science. Sandra Harding says that the moral and political insights of the women's movement have inspired social scientists and biologists to raise critical questions about the ways traditional researchers have explained gender, sex, and relations within and between the social and natural worlds. Some feminists, such as Ruth Hubbard and Evelyn Fox Keller, criticize traditional scientific discourse as being historically biased towards a male perspective. A part of the feminist research agenda is the examination of the ways in which power inequities are created or reinforced in scientific and academic institutions. Physicist Lisa Randall, appointed to a task force at Harvard by then-President Lawrence Summers after his controversial discussion of why women may be underrepresented in science and engineering, said, "I just want to see a whole bunch more women enter the field, so these issues don't have to come up anymore." Interesting. Lynn Harkinson Nelson writes that feminist empiricists find fundamental differences between the experiences of men and women. Thus, they seek to obtain knowledge through the examination of the experiences of women and to uncover the consequences of omitting, misdescribing, or devaluing them to account for a range of human experience. And then it goes on to repeat something that was said before. Another part of the feminist research agenda is the uncovering of ways in which power inequities are created or reinforced in society and in scientific academic institutions. Furthermore, despite calls for greater attention to be paid to structures of gender inequality in the academic literature, structural analysis of gender bias rarely appear in highly cited psychological journals, especially in the commonly studied areas criticism of feminist epistemology is that it allows social and political values to influence its findings. I could definitely see how that could be a very troublesome variable to control for, as your value kind of determines how represented a group should be, because that's a moral-based, kind of ethics-based idea instead of a necessarily scientific or demographic-based idea. E.g., if you think that a group deserves to have equal representation within a workforce, but doesn't equally represent the amount of workers in that workforce, e.g., you want 50% of the workforce to, the higher-ups to be of a minority that's only 10%, scientifically that doesn't work out, but I'm sure ethically there are good arguments to make. So yeah, I can definitely see how that might be a variable which is hard to control for. Susan Hack, AA Hack, also points out that the feminist epistemology reinforces traditional stereotypes about women's thinking as intuitive and emotional, etc. Mirananda further cautions that this may in fact trap women within traditional gender roles and help justify patriarchy. Very interesting. Flow-on consequences are a fundamental part of the ideas of what intellectualism is. It's seeing cause and effect and linking between different things. The more links you can find, the more intrigue is to be had, as the more something relates to things you already know, usually the more you are interested in it. And I think it's super interesting to see cause and effect in play, especially in philosophy, and what it means practically in terms of people's lives. Interesting. Now to biology and gender, a rather controversial topic, to say the least. Modern feminism challenges the essentialist view of gender as biologically intrinsic. For example, Anne Foster Sterling's book, Myths of Gender, explores the assumptions embodied in scientific research that support a biologically essentialist view of gender. In Delusions of Gender, oh, that's a very clever pun with delusions of grandeur. In Delusions of Gender, Cordelia Fine disputes scientific evidence that suggests there is an innate biological difference between men and women's minds, asserting instead that cultural and societal beliefs are the reason for differences between individuals that are commonly perceived as sex differences. Very interesting. I can definitely see how that is controversial and possibly not widely accepted in the scientific community. I mean, we know that a lot of the time the structure of the brain relates to its function and how it works, as physiology and anatomy are so often linked. Not always. Not always. For example, a larger brain does not necessarily mean a smarter brain. Usually males have around 10-15% larger brain, but of course there is no IQ difference between males and females. If you look at studies supporting really large populations, there isn't really an IQ difference. There may be, however, an educational difference. But yeah, saying that there are other things such as hormones, we know for a fact, for an evidence-based fact, that the hormones you have in your system alter your thinking and behaviour. That's partly what a hormone does. And we know for a fact also that biological male hormones influence your brain in a different way than female biological hormones do. video. What I just said was really a major oversimplification of what I've learned in the past, and I'm sure a massive oversimplification of what there is to learn if we were going to go down that road on this channel. Anyway, so without further ado, let's keep going. Now moving to feminist psychology. Feminism in psychology emerged as a critique of the dominant male outlook on psychological research, where only male perspectives were studied with all male subjects. As women earned doctorates in psychology, females and their issues were introduced as legitimate topics of study. Feminist psychology emphasizes social context, lived experience, and qualitative analysis. Projects such as Psychology's Feminist Voices have emerged to catalogue the influence of feminist psychologists on the discipline. I'm sure that feminist and female psychologists have played a massive role on psychology, especially as if you look at the demographics for psychology in general, in a lot of places and a lot of countries, females make up a hefty percent of psychologists overall. So I'm sure the contribution is massive. That again, feminist psychology is its own Wikipedia. Architecture, gender-based inquiries into and conceptualization of architecture have also come about, leading to feminism in modern architecture. Piyush Mathur coined the term archigendric, claiming that architectural planning has an inextricable link with the defining and regulation of gender roles, responsibilities, rights, and limitations. Mathur came up with the term to explore the meaning of architecture in terms of gender and to explore the meaning of gender in terms of architecture. Sadly, there it doesn't really go into any of the claims or evidence for what it even means for there to be gender-based architecture, but I'm sure that that is an interesting read. Now, businesses. Feminist activities have established a range of feminist businesses, including women's bookstores, feminist credit unions, feminist presses, feminist mail-order catalogues, and feminist restaurants. These businesses flourished as part of the second and third waves of feminism in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. In visual arts, corresponding with general developments within feminism and often including such self-organizing tactics as the consciousness-raising group, the movement began in the 60s and flourished throughout the 1970s. Jeremy Strick, director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, described the feminist art movement as the most influential internal movement of any during the post-war period. Very high praise. And Peggy Phelan says that it brought about the most far-reaching transformations in both art making and art writing over the past 4 decades. Wow. Feminist artist Judy Chicago, who created The Dinner Party, a set of vulva-themed ceramic plates in the 70s, said in 2009 to Art News, "There is still an institutional lag and an insistence on a male Eurocentric narrative. We are trying to change the future, to get girls and boys to realize that women's art is not an exception, it's a normal part of art history." A feminist approach to the visual arts has most recently developed through cyber-feminism and the post-human turn, giving voice to the ways contemporary female artists are dealing with gender, social media, and the notion of embodiment. Cyberfeminism. Interesting. Now, literature. The feminist movement produced feminist fiction, feminist non-fiction, and feminist poetry, which created new interest in women's writing. It also prompted a general re-evaluation of women's historical and academic contributions in response to the belief that women's lives and contributions have been underrepresented as areas of scholarly interest. There has also been a close link between feminist literature and activism, with feminist writing typically voicing key concerns or areas of feminism in a particular era. Much of the early period of feminist literary scholarship was given over to the rediscovery and reclamation of texts written by women. In Western feminist literary scholarship, studies like Dale Spender's Mothers of the Novel in 1986 and Jane Spencer's The Rise of the Women's Novelist 1986 were groundbreaking in their insistence that women have always been writing. Interesting. Commensurate with this growth in scholarly interest, various presses began the task of reissuing long out-of-print texts. Virago Press began to publish its large list of 19th and early 20th century novels in 1975, and became one of the first commercial presses to join in the project of reclamation. In the 1980s, Pandora Press, responsible for publishing Spender's study, issued a companion line of 18th century novels written by women. More recently, Broadview Press continues to issue 18th and 19th century novels, many hitherto out of print, and the University of Kentucky has a series of republications of early women's novels. Particular works of literature have come to be known as key feminist texts. A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the earliest works of feminist philosophy. A Room of One's Own in 1929 by Virginia Woolf is noted in its argument for both a literal and figural space for women writers within a literary tradition dominated by patriarchy. The widespread interest in women's writing is related to the general reassessment and expansion of the literary canon. Interest in post-colonial literatures, gay and lesbian literatures, writing by people of colour, working people's writings, and the cultural productions of other historically marginalised groups has resulted in a whole-scale expansion of what is considered literature and genres hitherto not regarded as literary, such as children's writing, journals, letters, travel writing, and many others are now the subjects of scholarly interest. Most genres and subgenres have undergone a similar analysis, so literary studies have entered new territories, such as the female Gothic or women's science fiction. Interesting. I have listened to many a short story with science fiction and females as the main protagonist. But I'm not sure if that is what they mean by women's science fiction, or if that is perhaps another thing altogether. According to Else Ray Helford, science fiction and fantasy serve as important vehicles for feminist thought, particularly as bridges between theory and practice. Feminist science fiction is sometimes taught at the university level to explore the role of social constructs in understanding gender. Notable texts of this kind are Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, 1969, Joanna Russ's The Female Man in 1970, Octavia Butler's Kindred in 79, and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale in 85. Feminist non-fiction has played an important role in voicing concerns about women's lived experiences. For example, Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was extremely influential, as it represented the specific racism and sexism experienced by black women growing up in the United States. In addition, many feminist movements have embraced poetry as a vehicle through which to communicate feminist ideas to public audiences through anthologies, poetry collections, and public readings. Moreover, historical pieces of writing by women have been used by feminists to speak about what women's lives would have been like in the past, while demonstrating the power that they held and the impact they had in their communities even centuries ago. An important figure in the history of women in relation to literature is Hrothgar was a canoness from 935 to 973. As the first female poetess in the German lands and first female historian, Hrothgar is one of the very few people to speak about women's lives from a woman's perspective during the Middle Ages. A very interesting episode indeed. Sadly, this video won't be as long as some of the others, as I do have to go to work, but thank you so much for taking a pause, a rest, a break, a reprieve,